In a modest art district nestled between high-rise buildings and bustling streets, there stood an unassuming studio, its windows often clouded with the remnants of rain or dust from the ever-moving traffic outside. Inside this humble space, a black artist named Elijah Williams worked tirelessly, surrounded by half-finished canvases and scattered brushes. His studio was a sanctuary of creativity, yet it was a sanctuary that few ever noticed. Elijah wasn't new to the world of art. He had been honing his craft for over 2 decades, his hands skilled in the language of color, texture, and emotion. Yet despite his brilliance, Elijah's name was not one that hung on the walls of prestigious galleries or appeared in the headlines of art magazines. Instead, he sold his work to local patrons, most of whom didn't fully understand the layers of meaning and history embedded in each stroke of his brush. He was content with his quiet life. His art was his voice, and he poured his soul into each piece. But there was a longing, an ambition to be seen, to be understood, to be appreciated for the depths of his work. Yet no one had come along to truly grasp the weight of what he was creating. That was until he heard about the Hargraves Gallery, a renowned gallery in the heart of the city. Its owner, Victor Hargrave, was known as a tastemaker, a man who controlled the flow of the art market. His gallery was the epitome of prestige, and every artist who managed to have their work showcased there was instantly elevated to the highest ranks of the art world. Elijah's heart raced as he prepared to take the plunge. He decided it was time to send one of his pieces to Hargraves, a bold and daring move for an artist who had always shied away from the spotlight. His best work, a sweeping abstract piece titled Eclipse of the Soul, was something he knew could turn heads if only given the chance. The painting was a blend of vivid blues, deep purples, and fiery oranges, swirling together to form an image that, when viewed from different angles, told an ever-evolving story of the human condition. But when Elijah arrived at the Hargraves Gallery with his painting in hand, he was met with a cold reception. The young assistant at the front desk barely glanced up from her phone as she told him to leave the artwork with her for review. She was polite, but there was no sense of urgency, no recognition of the passion that had gone into Elijah's work. "I'll pass it on to Mr. Hargrave when he has a moment," she said, with a slight nod as if she'd heard this type of story hundreds of times before. She didn't know that Elijah had traveled an hour across town, nor did she understand the weight of the journey he had just undertaken in the name of his art. It wasn't until the following week that Elijah received his first response, a letter postmarked from the gallery. It was brief, to the point, and a direct rejection. "Dear Mr. Williams, thank you for submitting your work to the Hargraves Gallery. After careful review, we regret to inform you that we are unable to showcase your piece at this time. We are currently looking for art that better suits the tastes of our clientele. We appreciate your interest in our gallery and wish you the best in your future endeavors. Sincerely, Victor Hargrave." Elijah stared at the letter in disbelief. The rejection stung, but it wasn't the first time his work had been dismissed. What hurt the most was the lack of understanding, the lack of recognition for the complexity of his piece. Better suits the tastes of their clientele? He thought. The words were cold and final, and it was clear that Hargraves Gallery wasn't interested in work that challenged the status quo. But what hurt even more was the feeling that this was just one of many galleries he'd be turned away from. He couldn't help but wonder, was this what the art world truly valued? Was this what it took to be seen? Was his work just too radical, too outside the lines for people to understand? As days passed, Elijah's frustration grew. But it also sparked something inside him. It wasn't just about selling art anymore, it was about proving himself. He was an artist, and he knew his worth. He didn't need the approval of men like Hargrave to validate his creations. His art spoke for itself. And it was in the depths of this frustration that Elijah began working on his next piece. He would show them. He would show the world the power of his art, even if it meant doing it on his own terms. His studio, once a quiet and solitary space, became a battleground, a place where he would take everything he had learned over the years and pour it into a creation that would change everything. Weeks passed since Elijah Williams received his rejection from the Hargraves Gallery. The sting of that letter still lingered in his mind, but he refused to let it cripple his spirit. Instead, it fueled him. Each day, he worked with renewed vigor, pushing his artistic boundaries, experimenting with new techniques, and incorporating deeper personal meaning into his pieces. Elijah knew that his art was something special, and though he had yet to find the right person to recognize it, he had no intentions of giving up. Meanwhile, Victor Hargrave, the owner of the prestigious Hargraves Gallery, was riding high on his reputation. His gallery was widely considered the most influential in the city, and it boasted an elite roster of artists whose works commanded astronomical prices. Victor had built his empire on the idea that art was not just about creativity, but about taste and status. To him, art was about curating an image, not necessarily about genuine artistic expression. One afternoon, as Elijah was working in his studio, Hargrave held one of his infamous private events, an exclusive gathering for the city's wealthiest art collectors, critics, and influencers. The gallery had just unveiled a new exhibition, showcasing the latest works of several well-established artists. The event was nothing short of opulent, with champagne flowing freely and the elite mingling among the artwork as though it were a luxury to be consumed. Victor stood proudly at the center of the room, his sharp suit cutting a refined figure among the eclectic mix of paintings and sculptures. He was a man who lived for the approval of others, a man whose reputation was everything. His every word was measured, his every glance calculated to maintain the illusion of grandeur that surrounded him. As the guests moved between the pieces on display, Victor overheard a conversation that would soon ignite a fire of disdain in his chest. Two well-dressed patrons, an elderly couple known for their investments in art, stood before a large, vibrant abstract piece, one of Elijah's former works that he had submitted to Hargraves months ago. "Well, I must say, this piece has a certain energy to it," said the woman, inspecting the work. "But it's a bit too unconventional, don't you think?" The man nodded in agreement, his tone dismissive. "I agree. I've seen better work at the smaller galleries. This one's just a mess of colors. It's almost as if the artist didn't know when to stop." Victor, who had been nearby, couldn't resist joining the conversation. He sauntered over to the pair with a smug smile, adjusting the cufflinks on his shirt. "You're absolutely right," he said with feigned enthusiasm. "The artist is, well, let's just say, he lacks a refined sense of composition. It's bold, yes, but ultimately it's nothing more than an experiment gone wrong. I reviewed his work months ago, Elijah Williams, I believe his name was. I gave it a fair shot, but honestly, it didn't meet the standards of what we showcase here at Hargraves." The elderly couple exchanged glances, nodding as if they'd been given an expert opinion. To them, Victor Hargrave was a god of the art world, a man whose taste could make or break an artist's career. Victor continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "I tried to offer him a few pointers, but, well, sometimes you just can't teach talentless artists the difference between creative expression and chaos. He doesn't understand the market, the demand for something that's more, well, digestible for a wider audience." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, watching as the couple smiled in agreement. Elijah had been standing just outside the door, unaware that his former painting was the subject of such disparagement. But fate had a cruel way of working. As he entered the gallery, hoping to observe the event from a distance and perhaps get a sense of the art world's pulse, his ears caught snippets of the conversation. His heart sank as he realized they were talking about his work. The words stung, but it was Victor's voice that carried the final blow. Elijah felt the fury rise within him, an overwhelming need to confront the man who had dismissed him so easily. Victor Hargrave was surrounded by guests, yet the moment Elijah stepped into the room, Victor's attention shifted, and he turned his gaze toward the artist. "Ah, Mr. Williams," Victor said, his tone turning almost patronizing. "What a surprise. I see you've come to observe the latest exhibition. I trust you're enjoying the art we have on display." Elijah's fists clenched at his sides, the urge to lash out simmering beneath his calm exterior. He stood there for a moment, feeling every inch of his being resist the temptation to speak, to snap back. But he knew that confrontation, at least in this space, would only make him look desperate. Instead, he took a breath and approached the group slowly, with the poise he had spent years cultivating. "Actually, Mr. Hargrave," Elijah said, his voice steady but filled with an edge of defiance, "I was just admiring the work you've chosen to display here. It's curious, really, how some of these pieces have become such high-demand works. I suppose they reflect a certain standard of art that the market favors, despite their lack of depth." Victor's smile faltered for a brief moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "Well, Mr. Williams," he replied, "you must understand, art isn't just about the brushstrokes. It's about knowing what people want to see. It's about offering something that speaks to the audience, something that resonates with the times." Elijah raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a subtle smirk. "And I suppose that's why your audience enjoys digestible pieces of paint that require little thought. Perhaps that's why they don't truly see art for what it can be." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Victor's composure wavered slightly as the guests around them grew quieter, sensing the tension. "Listen," Victor said, trying to regain control, "I don't doubt that you have some talent, but in this world, it's about more than just talent. It's about connections, timing, and, most importantly, marketability." Elijah nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Then perhaps I'm simply not the kind of artist who fits into your little market." With that, Elijah turned on his heel and walked out of the gallery. The conversation had ended, but the battle was far from over. He knew one thing for sure, the world would see his work, whether Victor Hargrave liked it or not. Elijah Williams returned to his studio that evening, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. His encounter with Victor Hargrave had shaken him, but it had also solidified his resolve. As much as he had tried to remain humble, the words of the gallery owner stung deeply. Victor's dismissal had been more than just a critique of his work, it was an outright dismissal of everything Elijah had worked for, everything he believed art could be. But Elijah wasn't one to let defeat define him. Instead, he turned his frustration into fuel. In the quiet solitude of his studio, surrounded by the soft hum of his paints and brushes, he began a new piece, something entirely different from anything he had done before. This time, it wasn't just about creating art. This time, it was about sending a message. The piece he created was called Rebirth of the Soul. It was an ambitious painting, filled with symbolic imagery and abstract forms that conveyed the tumult of life, the rise from oppression, and the struggle for identity. The canvas was enormous, almost 5 feet tall, and the composition was a chaotic swirl of bold colors, sharp angles, and flowing lines that clashed and merged. It told a story of transformation, of breaking free from the constraints placed by society, of rising against the weight of prejudice and expectations. Elijah knew that this was the piece that would turn heads. It was more than just a painting, it was a manifesto. It was everything he had ever wanted to say, all captured in one stroke, one brush, one explosion of color. He worked for days without rest, obsessed with perfecting every inch. And when he was done, he felt a sense of completeness, as though he had somehow touched the very core of his being. Word about Elijah's latest work spread quickly, and soon, art critics began taking notice. A few independent reviewers, long tired of the predictable and monotonous art the mainstream world had been offering, saw Rebirth of the Soul and immediately recognized its brilliance. The piece was unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was raw, unapologetic, and fiercely personal, a reflection of Elijah's life and struggles as a Black artist navigating a world that wasn't always welcoming. Within a week, the piece was featured in several smaller but respected art publications. The critics praised Elijah's use of color and composition, his ability to evoke emotion with such intensity, and his courage to speak openly about the societal issues that shaped his art. The mainstream art world, which had once ignored him, was beginning to take notice. It wasn't long before private collectors began reaching out. A prominent New York gallery owner, someone who had been following Elijah's career from afar, made an offer to display Rebirth of the Soul in an upcoming exhibition. The price tag was astronomical, but it didn't matter, the demand for the painting was overwhelming. Within days, it sold to an anonymous buyer for more money than Elijah had ever dreamed of. For the first time, Elijah felt validated. His art, once dismissed as irrelevant, was now being sought after by those with the power to shape the market. The work he had created in the solitude of his studio had finally found its place in the world, and it was receiving the respect it deserved. But the success of Rebirth of the Soul was only the beginning. As the painting gained recognition, Elijah's name began to spread across the art world like wildfire. He was no longer just a struggling artist, he was a force to be reckoned with. Interviews, features, and gallery exhibitions followed in quick succession. The artist who had once been relegated to the shadows was now a star. Yet, even as his career began to soar, Elijah remained grounded. He knew that the recognition was only part of the equation. What mattered most to him was the art itself, the message, the expression, the power to connect with others on a deeper level. He was no longer creating just to survive in the art world. He was creating to challenge it, to provoke thought, and to inspire change. One evening, as Elijah stood in front of Rebirth of the Soul in his studio, admiring the piece he had poured his heart into, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and saw the name of a prominent art critic he had long admired. He answered the call, eager to hear what they had to say about his work. "Mr. Williams," the critic's voice came through, warm but with a sense of urgency. "I wanted to personally congratulate you. Your work has been making waves in the art world, and I believe you're about to see a huge breakthrough. We've been following your journey for some time now, and I have a proposition I think you should consider." Elijah's heart raced. He had been preparing for moments like this, when his success would open doors he had only dreamed of. But even as he listened to the critic outline the opportunity, something inside him told him that his journey was far from over. This was just the beginning of something bigger. The phone call ended with promises of collaboration, further exhibitions, and the potential for even greater recognition. Elijah set the phone down, his mind racing with possibilities. As he looked back at Rebirth of the Soul, he knew that this was only the first chapter of his story, a story that was about to take a dramatic turn. But even in the midst of his newfound success, Elijah knew there was something else he needed to do. There was one more person he had to confront, one more challenge to face before he could truly take control of his destiny. Victor Hargrave, the gallery owner who had dismissed him so callously, was still out there, living in his world of exclusivity and power. Elijah had already proved his worth to the art world, but now, it was time to show Hargrave that he had underestimated him. Elijah's next move would be more than just about creating art, it would be about taking back control from the gatekeepers who had tried to silence him. Elijah Williams had come a long way since his dismissal from Hargrave's gallery. Rebirth of the Soul had changed everything. His work was now being celebrated in art circles, and his name was on the lips of critics and collectors. Yet, in the back of his mind, one nagging thought remained: Victor Hargrave. The gallery owner who had dismissed his art without so much as a second glance was still out there, building his empire while Elijah's work began to soar. It wasn't just about the rejection anymore, it was about the principle. Elijah knew that Hargrave, with all his prestige and connections, represented the very gatekeeping system that had kept so many talented artists, especially those from marginalized communities, out of the spotlight. Hargrave was a symbol of the elitism in the art world, a world that only cared about what was palatable to the wealthy and powerful. Elijah's desire to prove himself had evolved from a personal challenge to a social one. He wasn't just going to succeed in spite of the art world's narrow views, he was going to break those views open. He wanted to show Hargrave, and the entire art establishment, that talent couldn't be boxed in. True artistry transcended the barriers of race, wealth, and exclusivity. It was universal. With this in mind, Elijah made his decision. He would return to Hargrave's gallery. But this time, he wouldn't be seeking approval. He wouldn't beg for a spot in their exhibitions. Instead, he would walk in as a buyer, a force in his own right, with the capital and the influence to change the narrative. Victor Hargrave's office was as pristine and polished as his reputation. Located in the back of the gallery, it was a luxurious space, with leather furniture, towering bookshelves filled with rare art books, and large windows that looked out over the city skyline. It was here that Victor made the decisions that shaped the careers of countless artists. It was here that reputations were made or broken. Elijah walked through the front doors of the gallery with a quiet confidence. He had been to Hargrave's before, but today, it felt different. This time, he was no longer the eager, humble artist seeking validation. He was a force of his own, and he intended to make sure Hargrave recognized that. The assistant at the front desk, who had once dismissed Elijah with indifference, now looked up at him with a slight expression of surprise. "Mr. Williams," she said, her tone polite but cautious. "How can I help you today?" "I'd like to speak with Mr. Hargrave," Elijah replied, his voice firm and steady. The assistant hesitated for a moment before picking up the phone and dialing the number to Victor's office. Elijah could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She clearly wasn't sure what to make of his sudden appearance, especially considering his previous interactions with the gallery. A moment later, she hung up the phone and gave him a small, awkward smile. "Mr. Hargrave will see you now." Elijah walked past her and made his way to the back office. When he entered, Victor Hargrave was sitting behind his sleek, mahogany desk, his signature smirk already in place. He rose to greet Elijah, but there was something in his eyes, an unreadable flicker, as if he wasn't entirely sure how to respond to this unexpected visit. "Elijah Williams," Victor said with an almost condescending enthusiasm. "I wasn't expecting to see you here today. I trust things are going well with your art career?" Elijah didn't let the sarcasm faze him. Instead, he smiled calmly, walking toward one of the chairs in front of the desk and sitting down without invitation. His demeanor had shifted. He was no longer the artist seeking approval. He was the one in control now. "I've been doing well, Victor," Elijah replied, his voice cool. "In fact, I've been doing better than I could have ever imagined. Rebirth of the Soul sold for a substantial amount. I've had several offers for private exhibitions, and collectors are starting to take notice." Victor's expression didn't change, though there was a subtle shift in his posture. Elijah could tell that Hargrave was still unsure of how to handle this situation. "I'm glad to hear that your work is finding its place," Victor said, his tone bordering on dismissive. "I knew it would eventually get some attention. But the question is, what brings you to Hargrave's today?" Elijah leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with Victor's. "I'm here because I'm interested in making a purchase. I've been considering expanding my collection, and I thought Hargrave's might have something worthwhile to offer." Victor's eyebrows rose in surprise. "A purchase? Well, that's certainly unexpected. I didn't realize you were in the market for such investments. But I can assure you, we have some of the finest works here, from well-established artists with a proven track record." Elijah smiled inwardly, knowing exactly what he was about to do. He wasn't here to buy anyone else's work. He was here to make a statement. "I'm actually interested in acquiring Rebirth of the Soul," Elijah said, his voice unwavering. "It seems like a fitting addition to your gallery, don't you think? You see, I've decided to expand my own collection, and I believe this piece would be a perfect fit for Hargrave's. After all, it's a groundbreaking work, one that's been widely recognized. I'm sure you'd agree." Victor blinked, clearly taken aback. He quickly recovered, but there was a noticeable shift in his tone. "I'm afraid Rebirth of the Soul has already sold. It was purchased by a very prominent collector in New York." Elijah leaned back in his chair, the faintest of smiles playing on his lips. "That's exactly why I'm here, Victor. I want to make sure that when I purchase art, it's from artists who understand the value of true expression. So, I think it's time I start investing in work that actually speaks to me. And I'll make sure to do so through the right channels, ones that recognize the power of art in its rawest form." Victor's smile faltered, and for the first time, he looked uncomfortable. He had built his reputation on gatekeeping, on controlling what art the public consumed. But Elijah had just flipped the script. He was no longer a hopeful artist, he was an influential buyer, a force capable of shaping the very art world that had once rejected him. "I'll be keeping an eye on your future acquisitions, Victor," Elijah continued. "You might want to consider expanding your horizons. With that, Elijah stood up, gave a brief nod to Victor, and walked out of Hargrave's gallery, this time on his own terms. Elijah Williams left Hargrave's gallery with a sense of satisfaction he hadn't expected. In that short meeting with Victor Hargrave, he had done more than just assert his place in the art world, he had forced Hargrave to confront the shifting tides of the industry. The very gatekeeper who had once dismissed him was now on the back foot, scrambling to adjust to the new reality that artists like Elijah were not only succeeding outside of the traditional art establishment, but were also redefining what success in the art world truly meant. As Elijah walked through the busy streets, the weight of his actions settled over him. He had faced down a powerful figure, a symbol of the elitism and exclusivity that had once made the art world feel inaccessible to him. And he had won. But more than that, he had shown that talent couldn't be confined by the walls of a gallery or the narrow expectations of the elite. He had proven that true art that spoke to the heart, that transcended the constraints of society, would always find its way to the forefront, regardless of the gatekeepers who tried to control it. The world outside Hargrave's gallery felt different now. Elijah wasn't just an artist, he was a movement. His work had inspired countless others, especially those from marginalized communities who had always felt shut out by the establishment. They saw in him a symbol of hope, a beacon of possibility that they, too, could carve out a space for themselves in a world that often overlooked them. As Elijah continued to build his career, he began to develop relationships with other like-minded artists. They were all united by a common vision, art that wasn't just about aesthetics or marketability, but about something deeper, something that challenged the status quo. These artists, from all corners of the world, shared a passion for pushing boundaries, for confronting the complexities of race, identity, and society in their work. Together, they formed an underground collective, one that aimed to upend the very notion of what art could be. Word of the collective's work spread like wildfire. They weren't just creating for the sake of art, they were creating to make a statement. Each piece was a challenge to the established norms, a call to action for those who had long been silenced. And as the collective's influence grew, so did their presence in the art world. The mainstream galleries, which had once been the gatekeepers, now found themselves scrambling to keep up. They were no longer the only avenue for success in the art world. Artists like Elijah were building their own platforms, connecting directly with collectors, curators, and critics through social media and independent exhibitions. The old system, built on exclusivity and elitism, was being dismantled before their eyes.